The Salt Debt of Taal by Calico Tales Publishing LLC. Ang utang ng lawa hindi nalulunod, binabayaran ng dugo o kabaitan. The lake's debt never drowns, it is repaid in blood or kindness. Before the ash began its patient fall, there was only the sound of oars, slow, steady, carving minor wounds in the dark surface of Taal Lake. Mara Dakwiki's arms ached with a deep, familiar burn, a pain that lived in the sinew and bone, a penance she paid each morning. This ritual was her only true prayer now. She kept the motion exact, 3 pulls, 1 rest, the old fisherman's prayer her father had taught her, a rhythm that felt like counting beads on an invisible rosary. For what we take, let us leave something whole. The morning before the lake took Lino, the world had felt too still, as if the wind were holding its breath, listening for a promise about to be broken. They had shared a tin cup of coffee boiled black over coals that smelled faintly of rain and coming grief. The banca creaked under their weight, the hull's skin so thin she could feel the lake's cold rhythmic pulse through it, a heartbeat that was not her own. Kung ako ang mauna, Lino said, his smile catching the dawn's first weak light. Tell the lake I paid my debts in full. The words were meant as a joke, a piece of the gallows humor that shore folk used to ward off what they all knew lived in the deep. Mara laughed, an old, tired sound that the mist seemed to swallow. She threw a bit of coffee into the water for luck, a small offering. He made a show of crossing himself, his knuckles rough and calloused, then tossed in a piece of suman from his pocket, sticky with brown sugar. For sweetness, he said, his voice softer now, earnest. So she remembers I was kind. Later, as the mist lifted and the sun burned through, they'd both noticed the silence. Not just quiet, but a profound emptiness. No birds calling from the volcano's slope, no frogs from the reeds, not even the distant comforting clatter of oars from other fishers. The lake looked polished, a sheet of hammered silver reflecting only their own faces back to them, stark and isolated. Lino leaned toward her, the scent of salt and him filling the small space between them. He whispered, his breath warm against her ear. Sometimes I think she only loves what she plans to keep. She'd smiled then, a tremor of fear running through her that she tried to hide. Her hand had trembled on the oar. The lake exhaled sulfur and morning mist, a breath that clung to the damp air like a shroud. In the distance, the volcano's silhouette rose like a giant asleep under a blanket of smoke, its presence a constant low hum in the back of her mind, a source of both life and annihilation. The air tasted faintly of coins and wet earth, the smell of old secrets. She dipped her fingers into the water, expecting the usual chill. Still, it was warm, unnaturally so, as if something vast and ancient beneath the surface was dreaming a fevered dream and did not wish to be disturbed. The warmth was a wrong note in the morning song, a subtle shift in the world's balance that set her teeth on edge. A bell from the far shore struck 5 notes, the sound carrying clean and lonely across the water, each tone a small death. In the soft blue of dawn, San Nicolas was still half asleep. From here she could see her bamboo hut, a square of shadow near the old jetty where smoke would soon rise for breakfast, and children would fetch water with tin pails dented like the moon. Her home, a place built of memory and obligation, a ledger of its own. She pulled in the first net. Fish shimmered silver against the dim, a frantic, beautiful violence. Lino had always said this was the hour when the lake showed its truest face. Before people speak, he told her, his voice full of a strange reverence, the water is honest. She could still hear him saying it, the way his laughter softened after, half mockery, half devotion. He had died, believing the lake could be reasoned with, that its moods were as readable as the skies, that its debts could be paid with simple kindness. She had lived since trying to prove him right, an argument she carried on with his ghost every single day. That last morning they went out together. He'd sung an old kundiman under his breath, one about debts and devotion. Kung ako'y mamatay, sa piling mo sana. If I should die, may it be by your side." His hand had brushed hers on the oar, calloused and warm, a brief grounding touch. The sky had been a clean, perfect blue, the kind that pretends not to know storms. When the banca tipped and the lake swallowed him, it was without malice or rage, a simple, quiet act of possession. That somehow was worse than any violence. She had screamed his name until her throat bled salt and ash. The lake did not answer, just a single air bubble rising and breaking with the softest sound, a final whispered word, paid. Now, years later, she rode the same path, her wrists remembering his strength even when her heart tried to forget. The dawn wind tugged at her kerchief, cold and insistent. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, twice, then fell silent as the first veil of ash drifted over the lake, turning everything gray and indistinct. The world exhaled, and the lake answered in kind. Mara looked up into the pale light, a whisper escaping her lips almost unconsciously, the old words a shield against the silence. For what we take, let us leave something whole. Then the first ash settled on her hand, light as confession, fine as salt. She brushed it away and saw the faint glint of silver in the water below, unaware that the lake had already begun counting. The ash fell like a promise. It wasn't the thick, world-ending blanket of the significant eruptions. Still, a constant, phantom salting, a patient sift that turned edges dull and remade every surface into the color of old debts. It settled on the skin of Taal Lake, where the wind pressed ripples into scales. It settled on the nets Mara Dakuikui mended, and the black hair she tied back with a strip of cloth. It dusted the gills of the tilapia in her pail, turning their silver to tired pewter. The taste of it, mineral, faintly metallic, lived at the back of her tongue like a word she had decided not to say. A woman with a toddler clinging to her skirt stopped at Mara's plank-on cinder block stall. The boy peered over the edge of the pail, his eyes bright with that curious, fearless gaze children have around water and things that have died. Beyond her stall, the village stretched out in low breath. A man patched nets with thread so fine it looked spun from spider silk. A girl in a yellow dress caught flakes of ash on her tongue, laughing until her mother smacked her arm with a sharp cry. Someone's radio coughed out a love song older than both singer and static, the melody thin and ghostly in the heavy air. "Ang bigat ng hangin ngayon," one vendor muttered to another, his voice low. "Parang may utang." The air feels heavy today, as if it owes something. They all laughed, but the sound was soft, uneasy, like people telling jokes at a funeral. Dogs slept with their noses tucked under their tails, trying to dream of cleaner air. Mara wiped her stall plank again and again with a damp rag, though it was already spotless. It was a nervous habit, an attempt to impose order on a world that kept settling its dust on you. "Your fish are always the best, Mara," the woman said, her voice a small comfort in the grey dawn of San Nicolas. Her slippers, damp from the wet sand, had taken the ash and left dark half-moons on the packed earth like phases of a waning moon. "The lake provides," Mara replied, the words tasting like rust in her mouth. "It's what you say, the proper response, because that's what Lino used to say before the lake took him, before it provided his body back to the shore 3 days later, lungs filled with water and volcanic silt, eyelids salted with ash like a prayer someone forgot to finish." As she scooped a wriggling tilapia into a plastic bag, something glinted near its gills. Not the soft, pearly glaze of living scale, but the clean, cold coin flash of worked metal. Her fingers, usually so nimble, fumbled for a moment. She thumbed it loose. A scale struck from solid silver, perfectly shaped, impossibly made. It stayed cold in her hand, a profound, unnatural cold that seeped past skin and into bone, as if it had once been in the deepest, sunless parts of the water. She slipped it into her pocket, the weight of it a sudden, heavy secret. The metal made her think of church cups, of communion wine, of promises that stain the mouth red. "Ingat," the woman said, exchanging pesos with a careful thumb count, the boy pressing his face into the fish smell. his eyes still fixed on Mara. "You too." The morning wore on, a slow procession of neighbors, the quiet barter of need and kindness. The ash continued to fall, a constant soundless whisper. Bells from the old basilica across the water skittered thinly over the lake's skin. This sound used to gather people into pews, but now only tallied the passing, empty hours. When the last fish was sold and the pail held only scales and a blunt smell of iron and lakeweed, a shadow fell over Mara. Upon Silas, who was as much a part of the lake as any rock or reed, stood there bare-chested, his skin the color and texture of cooled lava. He did not look at her, but at the empty pail, his pupils small against the bright, seeing more than was there. "The catch is good," he said, not asking, but stating a fact. "It is. The lake is generous." He finally looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw the flat, impenetrable green of deep water with the sun directly above it. But it is never free. It remembers debts. It keeps ledgers. Mara felt the silver scale turn colder against her thigh, a small, hard point of denial. "It's just a lake, Apo." Silas spat red beetle juice into the ash, where it sizzled and became a little wound in the grey dust. "Is it?" He walked away without leaving prints, as if the ground did not consider him a weight worth remembering. That evening she found Silas where the black rocks step into the lake like a broken staircase. The water around his ankles folded and unfolded, working at him the way a grinder takes slow, deliberate patience with a blade. He stood as if listening to something beneath the talk of waves, a deeper conversation. A story traveled ahead of him, different every time it was told. Some said he was born in the year of ash, carried from the old drowned church as a bundle wrapped in a banner that still smelled of incense and sulfur. Others said he had a twin who slipped under the water at 13 and came back into Silas's chest, a second, slower heartbeat the lake could hear. He never corrected anyone. He let the town decide which story it needed, knowing that all myths are true in their own way. "Do you feel it?" Mara asked, her voice quiet, and opened her hand. Silver caught the hour's last light and returned something more disciplined than shine. It seemed to absorb the twilight and give back a colder, purer version of it. The scale wasn't perfect. A nick at one edge, the kind a knife leaves when it meets bone. A line of tiny, almost imperceptible pits along the curve made it look made rather than born, an artifact of some unseen transaction. Silas didn't touch it. He watched the metal the way he watched approaching storms, like a man reading the minutes of a meeting that had already been decided. "You'll find it leaves a circle," he said, his voice a low rumble. "What circle?" "Where it sleeps," he said. "On wood, the grain pales. On metal, no rust forms. On skin." He nodded at her palm. She looked. A pale, faint ring had appeared on her skin without her noticing, like a place where a wedding band once lived for a very long time. She rubbed at it, but the mark remained. She felt the bones of her hand go, briefly, intensely colder, as if the lake itself had turned to inspect her from the inside out. "What is it?" she asked, her voice smaller than she wanted, almost a child's. "A scale," he said mildly, as if stating the obvious. "From a fish." It was a statement, but it sounded like a question. "From an agreement," he said, and the word settled in the air between them, heavier than its letters, dense with unspoken meaning. When she brought it inside and set it on her tin box, the usual evening smells of her small hut, charred garlic, boiling rice, motor oil on a rag, seemed to fall back a little, as if giving the scale room to breathe its own cold, clean air. A mosquito landed on it, its legs delicate against the silver, and then immediately reconsidered, buzzing away in a frantic panic. The candle light bent around the metal with a strange generosity, making the edges seem sharper and more defined the longer she stared. Mara lay down on her mat and closed her eyes, then opened them again almost immediately, not from fear, but from the distinct, unnerving feeling of being watched, the way a ledger watches a number before a hand writes it down for good. She retrieved the scale and put it back in her pocket. Sleep came as a list balancing itself in her mind. Lino laughing with his whole throat, the sound rich and real. a net pulling easily from the water, heavy with a good catch, the basilica bell chiming on a wind it did not deserve. Just before dreams went deep, the scale moved. Not much, a slight, deliberate shift against the seam of her pocket, like a fish adjusting itself in a bucket so it can face the right way to breathe. She pressed her palm there and said aloud to the darkness, more out of habit than courage, "Ingatan mo, take care." The words seemed to choose two directions at once, outward toward the lake and back into the cage of her own ribs. In the morning, where the scale had rested on the tin box, a faint, perfect ring was left behind, clean, bright metal inside a halo of settled ash. It looked like the kind of zero a careful hand makes before deciding where to start counting. The sputter of a two-stroke announced Igo, her brother, bringing their banca in. He was all hard edges and sharp wrists, sun-bitten and lean, with a boy's reckless eagerness still fighting the man's growing weariness in his eyes. Something new gleamed on the stern, metal, purposeful, like a freshly grown tooth. "A new motor," Mara said, her voice flat, devoid of the excitement he clearly expected. Their old one coughed more than it ran, a constant source of worry. "A good one," he grinned, the expression making him look young and carefree again. "Hardly used. We won't have to paddle from the corrals anymore, ate." He touched the cowling with a reverence men usually reserve for a good blade or a holy relic. "Where did you get the money, Igo?" The taste of ash in her mouth deepened, turning bitter. The silver scale in her pocket felt heavy as an anchor, pulling her down. He kept the grin, but it narrowed, became a mask. A shutter came down over his eyes, hiding whatever truth lay behind them. "A favor, from the lake." He tapped the cowling again, a nervous proprietary gesture, like a pact being signed and sealed. "I prayed for a way, ate." The next morning, it was just there, washed up by the old pier, tangled in the reeds, like a gift. "I pay her back in fish, 1/10 of every catch, a favor from the lake." The words fit too well in Mara's head, clicking into place like a stone in a heel, a pain you can't ignore. She looked past him to the water, the whole hammered gray face of it watching them back with the patience that rocks learn over centuries of being worn down. Later, as Mara folded the tarpaulin that kept the ever-present ash from her sleeping mat, a shout ripped the still afternoon air. A child, the same boy with the bright, curious eyes from her stall, had slipped from the slick bamboo pylons of the fish corrals. The water had him, and the lake made itself look calm and utterly indifferent about it. Mara ran. The sand caught and released her feet, like quick, shallow breaths. She kicked off her slippers and dove without a second thought. The lake's first touch was a shock, stealing the heat from her skin as she plunged down into the green-gray murk. The silence underwater was absolute. She reached out to the boy instinctively, a primal recognition, as a body that has loved can always find another body in the dark. She gripped his small shirt and kicked hard for the surface, for air, for life, but something grabbed her ankle. Not weed, not a submerged root. Fingers, cold, articulate, and impossibly strong. They weren't cruel, but they were insistent, as if the lake were calmly, methodically counting her. 1, 2, 3. The grip was possessive, proprietorial, as if a question were being asked and an answer demanded. She tore free on the 4th count, her lungs going blade bright with a desperate need. She broke the surface with a hard, ragged gasp, her throat burning, and a clamor of voices arranged themselves into hands that pulled them both onto the relative safety of the bamboo walkway. On the shore, coughing out the lake's stale metallic breath, she noticed something papery plastered to her palm. It looked like old pulp mashed to a paste, and it smelled like books left to float in a flood, an odor of rot and forgotten words. It clung to her skin with a strange, unnatural persistence. She peeled it off and saw ink spidered into lines, names and numbers that refused to blur despite the wet. Names, families she knew, their histories intertwined with the lake for generations. Beside each name, there were quantities, measures of fish, of net, of abstract favors. and beside those, a single word, repeated over and over in a precise monkish script that seemed both ancient and new, paid. She folded the page small, her hands shaking, and put the wet, impossible paper in the tin box where she kept Lino's wedding ring. The paper dried too slowly for something left out in the daylight. Hours later, when Mara lifted it from the tin box, the edges still bled moisture, like a wound that refuses to heal. She spread it carefully on the table, the candle low, the room smelling of fish oil and the ever-present ash. The ink had not run. The names gleamed black as volcanic glass, the numbers neat beside them, every line written by a hand that cared deeply about accounting. She touched her own name, written near the bottom. Dakui Kui Mara. The ink shimmered for a moment, then dulled, as if a cold breath had passed through it. Her Lola had warned her years ago when she was still a girl learning her letters on the back of brown paper sacks. Never write near open water. The lake reads faster than you. Lola used to say that every word written in sight of the lake made a copy of itself somewhere below, pressed into the silt by invisible, patient hands. One day it will read them back to you, she'd add, her expression half smiling, half serious. Mara had laughed then, thinking it just another fanciful story meant to keep children away from the dangerous docks at dusk. Now she wasn't laughing. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic trapped bird. She fetched a pencil stub from a jar, and with a trembling hand that she could barely control, she wrote on an empty corner of the page, "Test." The graphite sank into the paper at once, the strange fibers swallowing the word like a dry tongue drinking water. When she flipped the sheet over, the word had reappeared, backward on the other side, a perfect, dark mirror. Beneath it, a second word was forming, the ink coalescing from the damp paper itself, written in a neat, identical hand, "Received." A drop of water, sweat, or perhaps a tear, fell from her hairline onto the page and spread outward in a perfect, shimmering circle. Inside the ring, new names began to develop, not written, but revealed, like old photographs emerging from the chemicals in a dark liquid. Faces followed, no more than gray, shifting shadows, but they were detailed enough to make her breath catch in her chest. She recognized one instantly. Lino, younger, his smile unfinished, captured in a moment of life. Another face turned toward her, its mouth moving under the paper as though caught mid-breath. A silent, desperate plea she couldn't translate. Mara snatched the sheet back with a strangled gasp, her fingers recoiling as if burned. The images vanished at once, leaving only the cloying smell of algae and rust, and the damp circle on the paper drying to a dull, flat coin. Outside, the lake made a sound she had never heard before, a slow, deep inhalation. Not of wind, not of wave, but the kind of breath a vast thing takes when it decides to answer. The candle flame guttered sideways, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. In the sudden silence that followed, a voice spoke, not aloud, but through the bones of her wrist, the same place the silver scale had rung with its cold chime. "Accounts must balance." She pressed her palm flat over the words on the page until the heat of her skin blurred the ink, a futile gesture. Then she folded the page small, slipped it inside her blouse where it lay cold and heavy against her heart, and whispered the only prayer she could think of, a plea for ignorance. "Patawad, kung hindi ko maintindihan. Forgive me if I do not understand." When dawn thinned the clouds to a bruised purple, Mara carried the folded page through San Nicolas as if it were contraband light, a truth too dangerous to expose. Ash muffled the ground, making the village sound half asleep, a world wrapped in cotton. Children played tumbang preso with tin cans so dusty they looked as if they had been carved from bone. Dogs watched her pass with that sad, measuring patience of creatures that have already learned how to lose. She stopped at the Garcia's house first, the sharp, familiar smell of vinegar and frying milkfish thick in the air. Aling Nora met her at the doorway, flour streaked on her forearms like tribal markings, her face etched with a permanent, weary worry. "Mara, anak, you look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have." She showed the page, just one corner of it, Not enough for the older woman to read the names, only to feel the strange, damp, skin-like texture of the paper. The skin around Nora's eyes tightened into a web of fine lines. "Where did you find that?" "By the water. After the boy." "Then don't bring it here." The words came out fast, breathless, as if they'd been waiting for years for permission to escape her lips. Nora reached behind a faded curtain and brought out a smaller thing, carefully wrapped in a wilted banana leaf. Inside lay a stone no bigger than a coin, worn smooth and pale by time and touch, its surface engraved with the faint, almost invisible outline of a fish. "My husband carried this in his pocket for a year after our youngest drowned. The priest said it was blasphemy that I should throw it back into the lake, but the next morning 3 fat fish leapt straight into our empty pan while it was heating on the fire. I kept it." Her eyes watered, but her expression didn't soften. It hardened. "The lake remembers Hicha. It only pretends to forget when it suits her." Further down the road, a bamboo wall had been rebuilt in a hurry, the new slats still raw and pale at the edges. Mang Turo sat outside on a low stool, sharpening a bolo, its blade dull with a fine layer of rust. The rhythmic shk-shk of the stone against steel was the only sound in the ash-muffled air. "You're looking for stories," he said before she even spoke, not looking up from his work. "Everyone says you are. I'm looking for what's true." He laughed, a short, empty, bitter sound that the ash seemed to swallow before it could travel far. "Then stop looking here, in the land of the living." He held out his scarred arm. Across the dark skin, a network of pale scars ran like a river map. "Last year, the current caught me in the corrals during a squall. Should have drowned, but something pulled me up instead. A hand, cold as the lake bed, strong as a rope. When I coughed the water out on the shore, this was in my mouth." From his pocket, he drew a scale identical to hers and held it out on his calloused palm. "Now I leave 1 peso on the rocks every new moon for balance. A small tax. I'm still here, so maybe it's working." Mara wanted to ask how many pesos it took to buy peace, but the words felt small and useless in the face of such a stark transaction. She moved on, the paper burning faintly against her chest, a cold fire. The next morning, the market square buzzed with a low, nervous energy under the grey veil of ash. Vendors fanned flies away from piles of salted fish, their voices muted by the oppressive weight of the air. Mara walked between the stalls, carrying her covered basket and the damp ledger page folded deep in her blouse, feeling like a spy in her own life. At the barangay office, the captain sat behind a desk warped and swollen by years of humidity. A wall calendar from a local hardware store showed a month already half erased by greasy ash smudges. He was a man used to floods and typhoons, not mysteries. "You again, Dakwiki," he said without looking up from a stack of official-looking papers. "If this is about your stall permit, talk to Estrella." "It's about the lake," she said. The words came out small, half swallowed by the tired, rhythmic whir of the ceiling fan. That made him look up. His eyes were rimmed with red, either from smoke or sleeplessness. "The lake feeds us. What about it?" "It's collecting." She laid the folded paper carefully on his desk, careful not to let him see the names written on it. "There's a list." The captain frowned, then chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "There's always a list, Mara. We have lists for taxes, typhoon relief, and outstanding co-op dues. Maybe your dead husband made one too." Her jaw tightened. "He didn't write this one." From the window, the shoreline shimmered, indistinct through the falling ash. The captain followed her gaze. "Do you know how many fishermen I've buried because they thought the lake was listening to their prayers? It only listens when it's angry. Better to let it sleep." As she turned to go, a tricycle driver who had been leaning in the doorway, listening, whispered to the clerk, "Sabi ko sa inyo, may kumikislap sa tubig kagabi. Parang mga mata. I told you, something was shining in the water last night, like eyes." The clerk, A young woman with a rosary draped over her computer monitor quickly crossed herself. Maybe the old debts are waking. Mara left before anyone could stop her. Behind her, a ripple of uneasy laughter rose, forced, brittle, the sound of people trying to laugh a debt away. Outside, the ash seemed to thicken until it felt like breath you could choke on. At the corner store, two older women were gossiping beside the large glass jars of vinegar. "They say the Dakwaiku girl keeps a page that bleeds ink," one murmured, her voice a conspiratorial hiss. "That's why the fish come to her stall now." "Or why they don't," the other replied, her face grim. "Either way, utang pa rin. A debt all the same." Mara didn't look at them as she passed, but she caught her own reflection in the store's cloudy, distorted mirror, eyes hollowed out, her hair streaked white with ash. For the first time, she saw herself not as a debtor or a widow, but as a ledger, something cold and impartial, meant only to remember. At the edge of town, the old basilica waited, its bell tower leaning a little more each year, as if bowing to the weight of the volcano's presence. Ash had settled into the folds of every carved saint, giving them the look of tired, defeated soldiers. She found Father Elias in the sacristy, polishing a brass chalice that would never truly shine again. The air in the small room was thick with the smells of beeswax, old paper, and the damp, earthy scent of stone. He smiled without teeth when he saw her, a kind but deeply weary expression. "Mara Dakiki, I heard you were walking the village like an accountant for the dead." "I'm only asking questions, Father." "Good. Questions are holy until they find answers. Then they often become burdens." He listened patiently as she told him everything: the silver scale, the impossible page, the names and numbers, her husband's entry marked paid, and the new, unspoken line she felt waiting for her brother, a debt coming due. The priest's hands, which had been moving in slow, hypnotic circles, stopped. The polishing cloth rested on the dull brass. When she had finished, he set the chalice down carefully on a velvet cloth. "There are stories," he said, his voice dropping low, becoming part of the sacristy's ancient quiet. After the great eruption of 1754, the old town was buried. The church, the bell, everything. People say the sacristans salvaged what they could: candlesticks, scrolls, the records of baptism and debt. He crossed himself absently, a gesture of habit rather than faith. One boy, too young to read, was told to carry a book across the lake to safety. He fell in mid-crossing. When they pulled him from the water, he was alive, but the book was ruined, its ink washed away. Or so they thought. He nodded toward a heavy wooden chest in the back of the sacristy, the one with the heavy, rusted iron lock she'd noticed on previous visits. "A century later, during a drought, we found it again in the ruins, still damp, as if it had been weeping. I shouldn't tell you this, but there were marks inside, names of people who hadn't yet been born. I kept it because every parish is tasked with keeping its own ghosts." "Can I see it?" she whispered, the words barely audible. His face tightened with an expression halfway between fear and a strange, scholarly desire. "If I open that chest, the whole town will come to watch. They will want miracles or vengeance. I can't give them either. It would unmake the fragile peace we have." Mara leaned closer, her voice firm now, steady. "Then let me look, Father." Quietly. "One debt deserves another." He almost smiled, a weary, defeated expression twisting his lips. "You think the lake still bargains?" "I think it still listens." After a long, silent moment, he fetched a small, ornate brass key from a chain around his neck. "The saints will forgive me later," he said, more to himself than to her. The chest's hinges moaned like sick animals waking from a long, troubled sleep. Inside, wrapped in a cloth the color of old, yellowed milk, lay the ledger. The paper was thick and swollen, as if it were breathing slowly. Water stains bloomed across the pages like ancient, faded continents. Father Elias traced one corner with a trembling finger and whispered, "When I touch this, the air in the room goes cold, and I hear the bell of the drowned church tolling under the lake. but I keep it because forgetting is a worse sin than any other." Mara bent close. The book reeked of rot, copper, and the bottom of a deep well. A single fat fly walked across the open page, its wings clicking faintly, as if it were reading the script aloud. Her eyes found her family's folio, and there it was, written in a clear, elegant hand, Lino da Qui. Paid. Someone had pressed a single, perfect silver scale beside the word, like a saint's bone embedded in a holy reliquary. And just below Lino's name, the ink darker, fresher, still seeming to bleed and spread into the fibers of the page, was the last entry, Ego da Qui. Due. The next moonless night. "I thought I had escaped this," the priest said softly, his breath fogging in the cold air that emanated from the ancient book. "But the lake never lost its clergy. We only changed our vestments." When she looked up, his face was pale, his pupils small and bright, like those of someone who has been staring into a blinding light for too long. "Take what you came for," he said, his voice a strained whisper. "But be careful what you bring back." Outside, the sun had lowered itself into a thick haze. The lake glowed like melted metal, every ripple a signature waiting to be written down. Mara stood at the threshold of the church. The image of the ledger page burned into her mind, feeling the immense weight of all the names she'd never met pressing upward from beneath the dark water. When she left the basilica, the road was empty except for Apong Silas, who was sitting by the old bridge, threading a net that was already perfect. His gnarled fingers moved with a life of their own, as though following the strains of music only he could hear. "You spoke to the priest," he said, without looking up from his task. I felt the bell stir. Mara sat on the warm stone beside him. "He keeps the ledger. He's not the first." Silas tied a knot, pulling it tight with a practiced, efficient movement. During the old eruption, one of the sacristans carried the church records across the water in a wooden box. He was found days later, floating, his eyes open, his hands burned black. They say he saw the lake's heart. Since then, someone always keeps the book, because forgetting is the worst sin. She looked at his ancient, inscrutable face. "And what happens if we refuse to pay?" Silas smiled, a thin, tired, knowing expression. "Then it collects interest." That night, Ego returned late, his shirt damp with a rain that hadn't yet fallen. He avoided her eyes, moving around their small room with the careful, deliberate silence of a thief returning something he couldn't manage to steal. "You saw Father Elias," he said at last, his voice rough. "I saw our names." He sank onto his sleeping cot, the bamboo frame creaking under his weight. "I didn't mean for it to go so far, Ate. When the storm hit last year and the boat was breaking up, I prayed, just once. I said, 'Let me live, and I'll give back what's fair.' Then a light came from under the water. I thought it was lightning, but it stayed, a soft green glow. The waves went quiet around the boat. I felt something touch my wrist, cold and soft like silk, and I heard counting. 1, 2, 3, then nothing. The next morning the boat was whole again, not a scratch on it. He rubbed his arm, as if expecting to find a mark there still. When the new motor came, washed up on the shore, I thought, maybe it was payment in advance. Maybe she wanted us to eat, to be safe. Mara stared at him, her heart a cold stone in her chest. "You bargained without knowing the cost." He nodded, his head bowed. "Lino would have done the same." "No," she said, her voice trembling with a sudden fierce anger. "Lino knew better. He paid with himself so we wouldn't have to." Outside, thunder rolled once, a distant but deliberate sound, like a heavy book being closed. The air suddenly smelled of copper and rain. Ego whispered, almost to himself, the words lost in the growing darkness. "Maybe it's my turn." Mara turned away so he wouldn't see the tears that were suddenly streaming down her face. "Not while I'm alive." The sky that evening was the color of cooled iron, heavy, oppressive, without wind or the scent of rain, only a waiting quiet that felt deliberate and menacing. Mara could not stop reading her brother's name in her mind. Ego da Qui. Do. Each time she blinked, the ink seemed to darken. to bleed further into the page, as though the paper kept working, counting down the hours while her eyes were turned. She sat outside their hut, sharpening a knife she didn't need sharpened. Every long, slow draw of the blade across the whetstone made the same small, hollow note, metal speaking to stone, a sound of grim finality. Out on the lake, a single lantern on a distant fish corral swayed with the slow, inexorable rhythm of the water, looking like a lone heartbeat trying to remember itself in the vast darkness. Inside, Ego pretended to sleep. His breathing was too shallow, too measured, his occasional coughs too carefully timed. He had not eaten since morning. The bowl of rice she had left for him sat on the table, stiff and grey and cold. The new motor gleamed in the corner under a blanket of tarp, smelling of oil and salt and a promise poorly made. "Do you think she's angry?" he said at last, his voice muffled by his thin blanket. Mara didn't need to ask who he meant. If the lake were angry, we'd hear her. Angry things always make noise. He rolled over to face her, his eyes wide and childlike in the dim, flickering light from her candle. "Then what's this silence?" "Accounting," she said, the word tasting like metal on her tongue. A small, broken, humorless laugh escaped him. "You sound like Silas. He only says aloud what the rest of us pretend not to think." They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the sound of the water breathing through the bamboo slats of the floor. Somewhere nearby, a single frog began its monotonous, patient calling. The air in the hut tasted of tin and an old, familiar fear. Mara stood and poured the untouched rice into a pail for the morning pigs. When she came back, Ego was sitting upright, his elbows on his knees, his head bowed like a man waiting for a sentence to be read. "I didn't mean for any of it," he said, his voice cracking on the words. "I just wanted to keep us fed, Ate. Lino was gone, and I had to do something. I thought, if I asked nicely, she'd listen. I saw the silver fish jumping near the old pier one morning, and I thought it was a sign. I thought maybe she'd forgive us what she took from us." "The lake doesn't forgive," Mara said, her own voice hard, a shield against the pity that threatened to overwhelm her. "It balances." He flinched as if she had struck him. "So what now? You think you can barter with her? With a lake?" "I don't think," she said, her hand resting on the smooth, cool hilt of the knife on the table beside her. "I. He looked at her then as though he had only just realized who she was, what she was capable of. The ash outside shifted under a faint, sudden breeze. A sound like fine sand moving across glass filled the night. Then came another noise. Low, rhythmic, impossible to place. It pulsed up through the ground, up the bamboo stilts of the hut, and into the soles of their feet. A heartbeat, too slow and deep and powerful for any human chest. Ego crossed himself, his knuckles showing white in the dimness. "You hear that? She's reminding us what's due." The sky broke just after midnight. Lightning threaded itself through the clouds, white and skeletal, illuminating the world in stark, terrifying flashes of bone white and absolute black. The air tasted of iron and something much older, like the inside of a rusted, drowned bell. Mara stood by the banca, the ledger page tied securely at her wrist. The string of her old rosary cut faint grooves into her skin, each smooth bead a promise she was now ready to break. Ego argued without words, pacing back and forth on the wet sand, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice came out as a ragged whisper, already defeated. "Don't do this, Ate. Please. We can still run to town. We can hide till morning. The lake doesn't need to see us to find us." Her voice was steady, too steady. It frightened him more than shouting ever could have. The rain began softly, almost kind, the drops heavy and warm, making small, soft explosions in the thick layer of ash. She took the oar from the boat and pressed it into his hands. "If she comes for anyone, it will be me. You'll keep the banca steady, nothing else." He opened his mouth to protest again, but the thunder arrived at that exact moment, low, rolling, and utterly final. The lake had made up its mind. They pushed off into the black, churning water. The surface was unnaturally warm, rising in lazy, mighty heaves, as though some giant creature breathed just beneath them. Their lantern cast a trembling, insufficient coin of light that the lake seemed to inspect and find wanting. Around them, the silence stretched taut and thin. Even the frogs had stopped their nightly chorus. Halfway out, the first wave struck. It wasn't large, but it was wrong, coming from directly beneath them, not across the surface. The banca tilted violently, then recovered with a groan. Ego swore, his voice tight with fear, gripping the gunwale. "She's angry. She's collecting." Mara lifted the page tied to her wrist, now soaked through, the ink bleeding into itself like dark veins under pale skin. She tore it in half with a sudden, violent motion and shouted over the rising wind, a raw cry that ripped from the very depths of her soul. "Take me instead, a truer debt." For a single, silent heartbeat, everything stilled, the rain, the thunder, the churning waves. Even the lantern's flame froze in its glass prison. Then the world turned white. The wind hit them from every direction at once. The banca spun like a child's toy. The lake surged upward, a solid wall of black water swallowing its own reflection. Mara felt hands around her ankles, cold and deliberate. They weren't pulling her down, they were counting. 1, 2, 3. She fell forward into the water, into a body that had no edges, into the vast, cold heart of the lake. Down here, color ended. Sound originated from within her own bones, a low, resonant humming, not from outside them. The pressure was immense, a crushing physical weight on her soul. Shapes moved in the oppressive dark, slow, luminous outlines like people drawn in faint, ghostly light. Their faces were wrong, flattened and distorted, rippling with the unseen currents. She recognized one, Lino. He looked exactly as he had the day before he died. His hair slicked back, his shirt open to the chest, that familiar, lopsided grin half there on his face. He reached out toward her, his fingers splayed. When they touched, her lungs, which had been burning for air, filled with the taste of him. Lake water and salt and something metallic. The same cold, ancient scent the ledger carried. His mouth moved, forming words that did not make a sound, but that she heard perfectly in her mind. "Not you." Mara's hand closed around the hilt of the knife she had tied to her belt. The lake's immense pressure made her arms feel heavy, her thoughts slow and thick as silt. Not another payment, she thought, the profound cold of the deep clarifying her purpose, burning away all fear. Not another name in the book, an ending, a 0 to cancel the count. She took the knife and drew its sharp point across the inside of her palm. Blood bloomed like ink in the water, a deep, living crimson unraveling into the darkness, a defiant splash of life in the realm of the dead. She found the torn ledger page floating near her, impossibly intact, its edges glowing with a faint, pale light. Using her own blood as ink, she drew on its surface, not words, but a single, deliberate mark. It left a trail that refused to dissolve, the blood coalescing into a perfect circle within a circle, a balancing mark, a final, definitive 0. "Debt owed by the lake," she whispered through the water, her voice a stream of bubbles, torn and distorted. "Payment," the ledger itself. The current convulsed around her. Beneath Mara's feet, the lake floor shuddered, a deep, powerful groan rising up through centuries of sediment and bone. Bubbles erupted all around her, hissing upward in frantic spirals. The silver scales, dozens, then hundreds, rose up from the black depths, swirling around her like a school of frantic silver fish, all of them circling her bleeding, outstretched hand. Each scale flickered once, as bright as lightning under glass, before turning a dull, dead gray and sinking back into the endless depths. For a moment, the water around her cleared. In that instant of perfect, terrible clarity, Mara saw everything. The ruined, silt-encrusted church bell below her, statues of saints half buried in the mud, fishing nets tangled around the skeletal ribs of ancient boats, human bones gleaming faintly in the silt. And between them all, something vast and dark moving, slow, faceless, a suggestion of a form shaped by current and ash and memory. It wasn't a creature, not in any sense she could understand, but the lake itself, remembering its own body. It opened to her, not with eyes, not with a mouth, but with a widening of pressure that let her see through it, into it. Inside was the crushing weight of every name ever written, every promise kept, and everyone broken. It didn't hate her. It simply wanted balance. It demanded it. Mara pressed her bleeding palm flat against the floating page. The circle she'd drawn flared with a brilliant red light, then turned a searing white. The page stiffened, became metallic. A ringing filled her skull, one clean, pure, cold note. The ledger was being rewritten. The debt was being paid. Up above, a bolt of lightning struck the lake's surface, turning it into a vast, shattered mirror. For a single heartbeat, every drop of falling rain turned to silver. Then the world exhaled. When the wave rolled over her, it was not violent, but it was final, like the closing of a heavy book. When she awoke, she was on the rocks near the shore, the storm breaking apart into a ragged, weeping drizzle. Her hands shook uncontrollably. Her mouth tasted of her own blood and ash. The torn page lay beside her on the wet stone, now hardened into a sheet of dull, lifeless metal, etched with her own spidery handwriting, but the words were gone, replaced by a single perfect circle carved into its face. The air buzzed with a silence so deep it hummed in her ears. Then she heard shouting, voices, the desperate splash of oars, Ego's voice among them, calling her name over and over again, frantic and high-pitched with terror. She tried to answer, but her throat filled with lake water that no longer burned. She turned her head toward the sound and saw him wading through the shallows, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief, his hands reaching for her, and behind him the water rose. It didn't come as a wave this time, but as a silent, vertical wall of quiet, deliberate movement. The lake's surface simply pulled itself up, its shape thickening, cohering, and closing around Ego like a fist. His shout was cut short. The wall of water folded back into the lake, leaving only a series of ripples that spread outward and vanished into the sudden, unnatural calm. Mara crawled to the water's edge and pressed her forehead against the cold, wet stone. A raw animal sound of pure grief tore from her throat, though no one was there to hear it. "I asked for me," she whispered, the words breaking, shattering against the terrible silence. "Not him." The lake said nothing, but the wind that passed over her in that moment smelled not of sulfur, but of rain on fresh soil, of things washed clean. She opened her hand. The wound on her palm had sealed itself into a pale, puckered scar shaped like a circle within a circle, the same mark that now glowed faintly on the metal page before it slid from the rock without a sound and sank into the shallows. She watched it go until even the faint light from it was gone. Before the bell, there was silence. Men walked the shore with long poles, turning over whatever the waves had decided to keep. Children picked through the thick mud for lost sandals. One woman held a framed photograph, wiping the ash from its cracked glass with the corner of her skirt until her fingers were raw and bleeding. At Mara's hut, someone had left a bowl of rice and 2 coins. She ate the rice cold, 1 grain at a time, her movements slow and mechanical. She left the coins on the windowsill. When she woke that night, they were gone, replaced by a single, perfect silver scale that caught the moonlight like a watchful, unblinking eye. By noon, the town had gathered at the basilica. The priest's bell still hung silent in the tower, its tongue snapped by lightning. Father Elias stood barefoot before the heavy wooden doors, his robe spattered with mud, a fresh cut across his forehead. In his hands, he held the metal page that had washed ashore, Mara's circle engraved deeply upon it. "This," he said, his voice carrying with a strange new authority that no one had ever heard from him before, "is what remains of our old book." No one spoke. The air was thick with the sour, sweet smell of wet ash and burning copra. He set the page on the stone altar, where a single shaft of sunlight caught its surface and scattered small dancing rings of light across the dusty floor. The lake has returned what was owed, he said softly. We will keep this as a reminder, not a relic. From the crowd, Aling Nora stepped forward, her face grim and set like stone. And the rest of us? What do we write now? Something kinder, he said. Then he turned to Mara, who stood at the back of the crowd, trying to be invisible. You began this. You'll keep it. She shook her head, the slight motion making her dizzy. I only finished what it started. All the same. He handed the page to her. It was warm to the touch, almost pulsing with a faint, rhythmic energy. Around its edge, she could see faint, new scratches forming, small, even strokes, as though an unseen, invisible hand was continuing to engrave it. The first morning after the storm, the village reeked of stone and damp, burnt air. Men walked the shore with poles, stirring the debris the waves had left behind. The water had gone glass still, but the sand was littered with unfamiliar things, half-melted nets, driftwood polished to the smoothness of bone, and thousands of silver scales that gleamed like fragments of a shattered mirror. Children collected them the way other children might pick flowers, until their mothers snatched the bright, sharp pieces away and threw them back into the water with hurried, fearful crosses of the hand. Mara woke to that heavy silence. Her hut still stood, though the lake had reached the first rung of its bamboo stilts and had left a muddy, indelible watermark, like the line on a measuring cup. Every joint in her body ached. Her hair smelled of sulfur and deep water. She tried to call Ego's name, but found that she had no voice left for it. What came out was only a dry whisper of air, as if the lake had taken back its echo. Apong Silas found her sitting on the step, wrapped in a blanket someone had left for her during the night. He offered no greeting, only a tin mug of coffee that had gone cold. He sat beside her, silent for a long, long time. It spared you, he said at last, his voice flat, not sounding sure whether that was a blessing or a curse. It didn't spare him. Her voice was a raw, painful croak. No, Silas said, his gaze fixed on the calm, placid water. But it ended the account. I think that's the closest thing to mercy we ever get from that water. She looked past him to where the fish corrals had once stood. All that remained were a few splintered poles pointing at nothing, each one capped by a faint mocking sheen of ash. What happens now? She asked, the question hanging empty and heavy in the still air. Now. Silas squinted at the distant horizon. Now we learn to live on credit again. Weeks passed. The ash thinned, becoming part of the soil. The volcano kept its temper. The people of San Nicolas went about the slow, arduous task of rebuilding with the weary, practiced industry of survivors who had done this all before. They spoke of the storm as if it were a neighbor's quarrel, loud, violent, and regrettable, but now settled. The phrase utang ng lawa, the lake's debt, slipped back into everyday talk, but it no longer meant fear. Now it meant reminder. Mara rebuilt her stall near the jetty. As she swept the last of the ash from the weathered planks, she watched Mang Turo helping his neighbor rethatch a damaged roof. When the work was done, the neighbor offered him a few crumpled coins. Mang Turo gently waved them away. We pay each other back by being here tomorrow, he said, his voice rough but kind. The words settled in Mara's chest, a small, warm weight. That afternoon, she found an old school pad and carefully tore off the cover. On the first clean line, in a hand that was surprisingly steady, she wrote, Debts among the living. Under it, she wrote Apong Silas's name, and beside it, the words, 1 coffee. Then she drew a small, neat circle beside it, 2 rings, touching like joined hands. By sundown, the page held 10 names. A young boy who saw her writing asked to add his own entry in his clumsy, childish scrawl. Promise. Bring a broom for the hut. One person owed a basket of rice, another owed the mending of a shirt, and another owed a trip to fetch fresh water for an elder. The handwriting varied. Someone doodled a small, smiling fish. Someone else added a radiant sun. The list looked childish, amateurish, Yet when Mara read it over, her chest felt lighter than it had in months. The priest revisited her near the end of the week. He watched as she shaded in the circles next to the fulfilled promises with the soft graphite of her pencil, tracing them until they gleamed faintly in the fading light. "You've made a new book," he said, his voice full of a quiet awe. "No," she replied, not looking up from her work. "Only a better way to count." He nodded slowly. "Then, when you tire of keeping it, it will rest in the church chest with the other things that have survived." "I'll bring it when it's full," she said. He smiled. "And if it fills quickly?" "Then we'll make more paper." They shared a small, soft laugh that startled them both with its simple, unexpected warmth. 1 year later, the ash had turned to fertile soil, and the lake's breath smelled of wet grass and new life instead of sulfur. The fiesta of San Nicolas returned with banners of bright, hopeful cloth, though the colors looked strangely muted under the perpetually pewter sky. Children paraded paper fish on sticks, their scales painted silver and copper. Each one bore a small circle drawn in charcoal, a new tradition whose origins they would never fully understand. Mara stood at her stall, the new ledger open beside a basin of fresh catch. The pages were nearly complete, names, promises, and payments written in many different hands. One column read, "Repaired roof, 2 baskets of rice." Another, "Watched child, 1 song." The priest stopped by, his clean robes already flecked with new ash. He smiled when he saw the ledger. "It's heavier than it looks." "It carries well," she said. He tapped the margin where a child's messy, earnest scrawl had been written. "No one owes the lake anymore. You've made a gospel of the ordinary." She laughed softly, a sound that was no longer empty. Maybe that's all miracles are. The procession passed by, led by a borrowed bell from a nearby parish. It rang with an uneven, hesitant tone, as though it were remembering the immense weight of the drowned. The crowd sang in low, solemn voices, the sound carrying out over the water like forgiveness, learning how to breathe again. Later, when the last of the candles had been extinguished and the fireworks had burned themselves into smoke and memory, Mara walked to the jetty. The calico cat, a silent, constant companion in her new life, followed, weaving through her steps. Across the lake, faint lights dotted the opposite shore. Some were lanterns on fishing boats, others the warm glow of distant ferries. One shimmered brighter than the rest, pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm, like a heartbeat. She opened the ledger to the last blank page. The moon was low and heavy in the sky, a silver coin half buried in a shroud of clouds. In the silvered, watery light she wrote, "To the lake, whose debts are settled in mercy." She drew a circle, and then another, their edges touching like joined hands. The air around her rippled once, a soft, invisible concussion. The lake's surface brightened, not from lightning but from within, a smooth, gentle luminescence spreading outward like a blooming memory. Beneath the water, something vast, slow, and calm moved. The glow faded, leaving behind only a profound stillness and the sound of the frogs, finally beginning their nightly song. Mara closed the book and looked down at the cat. "Maybe she's finally asleep," she said. The cat blinked, its strange, intelligent eyes twin mirrors of the moon. It stretched, turned in a perfect circle, and lay beside her. Together, they watched the first dawn light thread gold through the mist. The wind carried the faint scent of salt and mango, sweetness and ash, balanced at last. The lake keeps its silence. The ash still falls. But somewhere, someone remembers. This was The Salt Debt of Taal from Calico Tales Publishing LLC. Thank you for listening. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this. Visit calicotales.publishing.com.